There's a quiet, invisible war that many of us are fighting every single day, one we often mistake for stress, overthinking, or even ambition. But beneath the surface, what we're truly battling is the fear of not being in control. And that fear, subtle, chronic, often unspoken, runs our lives far more than we realize. From the perspective of Jungian psychology, this obsessive need to manage, predict, and dominate our external world is not a natural state. It's the desperate symptom of an ego that has forgotten its place in the psychic ecosystem. It has become inflated, believing itself to be the sole ruler of consciousness, while it has lost contact with the self, the deeper organizing center of the human psyche. And in that disconnection, something crucial is lost. Trust. Not only trust in life, but in the greater symbolic intelligence that animates us from within. The ego, convinced it must stand alone, begins to see itself as the sole architect of reality. Every challenge becomes a threat, every uncertainty a danger. So it tries to compensate by planning, micromanaging, and rehearsing imagined disasters. Worry becomes its default language. It sees vigilance as virtue and control as salvation. But in reality, this mindset is exhausting, and more than that, it's ineffective. It creates a loop. The more the ego tries to control life, the more life resists. The more chaos it tries to block, the more chaos it seems to invite. Because the unconscious, the world of symbols, emotions, dreams, and forgotten truths, is not a servant of the ego. It is a partner, a mirror, a force that insists on being heard. When the ego refuses to listen, when it tries to rule over the psyche like a tyrant, it triggers resistance from within. This resistance doesn't show up with banners and signs. It shows up in the form of tight chests, sleepless nights, racing thoughts, panic attacks, and intrusive fears that seem to have no root in reality. But they do have a root. It's just buried in the soil of the unconscious and watered by neglect. This internal conflict between the inflated ego and the rejected depths of the psyche is what Jung saw as the foundation of neurosis, not madness, but misalignment, not weakness, but disconnection. And at the heart of this disconnection lies a lie, the illusion of control. The ego tells us that if we just think harder, do more, prepare better, we can avoid suffering, that we can protect ourselves from the unknown. But the unknown isn't just out there, it's inside us too. And when we avoid it, when we avoid what we don't understand or want to feel, it doesn't disappear. It grows. It festers. It waits. Eventually it erupts, not to punish us but to call us back. The self, what Jung called the totality of our being, doesn't want us to suffer endlessly. It wants us to integrate, to return, to remember that we are not just minds solving problems. We are souls undergoing transformation. Worry in this light is not just a nuisance. It's a signal, a beacon, a psychic symptom that something essential is being neglected. Because worry is not the language of the self. The self speaks in symbols, in dreams, in synchronicities, in intuitions and longings and quiet moments of peace that make no rational sense. The self is not afraid of the unknown. It is the unknown and also the deep familiarity beneath it. So if your days are marked by anxiety, by mental rehearsals of catastrophe, by fear of what might go wrong, perhaps the deeper question is, what is your ego trying to protect you from? And who would you be if you didn't need to protect yourself all the time? This isn't a call to give up responsibility. It's a call to recalibrate where responsibility begins. Because your deepest responsibility is not to control life. It's to stay connected to your inner truth. And that truth lives in the self. When the ego tries to replace the self, it becomes neurotic. But when the ego begins to listen, really listen to the deeper wisdom of the unconscious, something shifts. The war softens, the anxiety eases, the need to control begins to fade, not because everything becomes certain, but because we've made peace with not needing it to be. And in that moment something extraordinary happens. We come home to ourselves. What if your anxiety wasn't a flaw to be fixed, but a signal that something inside you is out of alignment? Most of us are taught to see anxiety as a problem in the mind, a glitch in the system that needs to be patched. But that view misses the deeper truth, that anxiety often arises when our conscious identity, the ego, refuses to engage with the full reality of who we are. The ego wants to be in control. It wants clarity, logic, safety. It wants to look competent, organized, calm. But the inner world doesn't obey those rules. It's not linear or predictable. It's emotional, symbolic, and wild. And when the ego insists on silencing this inner dimension, on pretending it doesn't exist or doesn't matter, it ends up rejecting the very source of its vitality. That rejection creates tension, a fracture, an inner split between what we allow ourselves to acknowledge and what we push into the dark. Imagine trying to steer a ship while ignoring the compass, the wind, and the stars. The ego does this when it shuts out the unconscious. It wants peace, but only on its own terms. It wants healing, but only if it can stay in control of how and when it happens. It wants wholeness, but only if it doesn't have to change. And so, we become divided. One part of us insists on control, structure, and order. The other, intuitive, creative, emotional, knows that life doesn't work that way. When these parts are in conflict, we feel it everywhere, in our sleep, in our breath. In the constant hum of anxiety that runs just beneath the surface, we try to manage it by doing more, by planning, preparing, performing. We fill our days with tasks, our calendars with obligations, our minds with loops of thought that lead nowhere. But no amount of control can silence the deeper voice inside. It will always find a way to speak, and often it speaks through anxiety. That's because anxiety is not just a reaction to the outside world. It's a message from within, a signal that something is being ignored, that we're trying to solve emotional and symbolic problems with logical tools, and it's not working. When we reject our inner experience, when we avoid grief, fear, vulnerability, or the unknown, those energies don't disappear. They retreat into the unconscious, where they build pressure. Eventually, that pressure finds a way out, through panic, through racing thoughts, through a gnawing sense that something is off, even when everything looks fine on the surface. This is the anxious ego, disconnected, overextended, and deeply afraid. Afraid not just of the world, but of what it might find if it turns inward, and so it lives in a state of alertness. Always watching, always preparing, but never resting. This cycle becomes self-perpetuating. The more we ignore the psyche, the more symptoms it sends. The more symptoms we resist, the more chaotic they become. We double down on control, on logic, on to-do lists and problem-solving, but we're using the wrong tools. You can't reason your way out of a symbolic crisis. You have to feel your way through it. That's the invitation anxiety offers. Not to fix, but to feel, to listen, to slow down. To ask, what have I not been willing to see? What part of me have I been avoiding? The psyche is intelligent. It doesn't send pain for no reason. It sends signals to bring us back into balance. And if we begin to treat our anxiety as a doorway instead of a dead end, we start to notice something profound. Beneath the fear, there is information. There is meaning. It might be grief we haven't grieved, anger we've suppressed, desires we've buried, or truths we've been too afraid to admit. When the ego tries to run the entire show, these parts get left behind. But they don't disappear. They become symptoms, they become fear. They become the things we're most desperate to avoid. But here's the paradox. Those are the very parts of us that hold the key to healing. When we turn toward what we fear, when we stop rejecting our own inner experience, we begin to soften. The ego, no longer burdened by having to do everything alone, begins to relax. And the anxiety starts to shift, not because we've gotten rid of it, but because we've understood it. And when understanding enters, fear begins to lose its grip. Peace doesn't come from more control. It comes from relationship, from reconnecting with the parts of ourselves we've abandoned, from learning to trust what we feel, not just what we think, from making space for mystery, uncertainty, and the wisdom of the unconscious. The ego doesn't need to disappear. It needs to listen. It needs to include what it once rejected, and in that inclusion, In that reconnection, we discover a truth we've long been seeking. We are not broken. We are simply being called home. We often believe that our fears come from the outside, from uncertain futures, difficult relationships, financial instability, or health scares. But what if the deepest fears we carry are actually internal? What if much of our anxiety is not about life itself, but about the parts of ourselves we've refused to face? Every human being carries a shadow, not evil, not dangerous, simply the unacknowledged, the repressed, the inconvenient truths about who we are, our anger, our envy, our insecurities, our unmet needs, our pain, our longing for power or tenderness or freedom. These are the aspects of us that, for one reason or another, we decided were unacceptable. So we pushed them away. We buried them. We pretended they weren't there, but the psyche doesn't forget. The parts we repress don't vanish. They take shape in the unconscious and begin to influence our lives from behind the scenes. They distort how we see the world. They shape the stories we tell ourselves. They leak out in our fears, our judgments, and our relationships. We start to see our shadow on the outside, the colleague who triggers us, the partner we can't trust, the neighbor who annoys us, the uncertainty that keeps us awake at night. We project our internal tensions onto external events and people, believing that they are the problem, when in reality they are mirrors. This is projection, the unconscious process by which we relocate what we cannot accept in ourselves onto others. It's a defense mechanism, and it works until it doesn't, because the more we try to keep the shadow at bay, the more aggressive it becomes. We start fearing things that have no clear cause. We become hyper-vigilant. We worry obsessively, not because the world is truly falling apart, but because we've disowned so much of our inner world that we no longer feel whole. There's an old saying, "What you deny controls you. What you accept transforms you." When we reject parts of ourselves, we lose energy. Our vitality is split. We spend mental and emotional effort keeping doors locked that were never meant to be shut. And the price is heavy. Chronic worry, low self-worth, conflict in relationships, cycles of sabotage and shame, and perhaps most painfully, we become strangers to ourselves. Projection offers temporary relief. It lets the ego maintain its story of being good and strong or in control. But deep down we feel the gap. We sense that we're not being fully honest, not with the world, and certainly not with ourselves. And so fear becomes our lens. We look to the future and see danger. We interpret neutral events as threats. We walk into rooms assuming we're being judged. We build our lives around avoiding pain instead of moving toward truth. But here's the paradox. What we fear most about our shadow is often its power. Because the shadow isn't just made of darkness. It's made of creativity we've suppressed, desires we've denied, truths we've been afraid to speak. It holds not only our pain, but our potential. And when we begin to explore it, not with judgment but with curiosity, we begin to reclaim pieces of ourselves we didn't even know were missing. Fear becomes a map. Every time you feel a disproportionate reaction, intense anger, jealousy, anxiety, or avoidance, it's an invitation, a signal. Not to control more, but to go deeper. To ask, what part of me is trying to speak right now? What am I avoiding? What have I projected onto this person or situation that actually belongs to me? This doesn't mean we blame ourselves for everything. Life is complex. People do hurt each other. There are real risks. But if we don't take responsibility for our inner landscape, we'll always feel powerless in the face of the external world. We'll always be at the mercy of what happens, because we've refused to see what's happening within. Reclaiming the shadow is not about perfection. It's about integration. It's about becoming whole, and that wholeness requires a kind of radical honesty. The courage to say, yes, I carry fear. Yes, I sometimes want to control everything. Yes, I have parts of me I don't like. And yet, I am still worthy of love, still capable of healing, still growing. This is the path toward liberation. Because once we begin to own our projections, something beautiful happens. The world softens. We stop needing everyone else to change. We stop reacting from fear and begin responding from awareness. We stop running and we begin to relate. We become less afraid of the unknown because we are no longer afraid of ourselves. And in that shift, anxiety loses its grip, not because the world has changed, but because we have. Because we've stopped fighting with our own reflection and started listening to what it's trying to show us. Every worry, every fear, every judgment, these are not signs that we are broken. They are invitations to come home to what we've left behind. And when we do, we find something unexpected. That the parts of us we feared the most were never here to destroy us. They were here to complete us. If there's a single question that sits quietly beneath every anxious thought, every restless night, every compulsive need to control, it's this: what if I'm not enough? This question isn't always loud. It's not always conscious, but it lives in the nervous system, in the inner tension between who we are and who we believe we're supposed to be, in the emotional gap between the ego and the deeper center of our being. And this gap, that psychic split, is where suffering takes root. The journey of healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering what we are beneath. The layers. Beneath the conditioning, the expectations, the shame, the survival strategies. And the name for this process is not change. It's integration. This is the path of individuation. Individuation is not about becoming more perfect. It's about becoming more whole. It is the long, intimate, sometimes painful journey of reconciling the conscious and unconscious parts of the self, of bringing together the light and the shadow, the thinker and the feeler, the controller and the surrendered, the wound and the wisdom. It asks us to move beyond binary thinking, not this or that, but this and that. Not either strong or vulnerable, but strong and vulnerable. Not just joyful or grieving, but joy and grief held in the same breath. This process isn't linear. It doesn't follow a clean, upward trajectory. It is messy, circular, deeply human. It moves in spirals. We return again and again to the same themes, but each time with more insight, more compassion, more capacity to hold what once felt unbearable. And most importantly, it requires relationship. A new relationship between the ego and the self. The ego is our conscious mind, our planner, our problem solver, our sense of I. It helps us function in the world. It gives us identity. But when the ego tries to become the center of everything, it collapses under the weight, because the ego was never meant to carry the totality of who we are. That role belongs to the self. The self is the deep organizing center of the psyche. It is both ancient and intimate. It knows us from the inside out. It doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't speak in language. It speaks in symbols, dreams, synchronicities, in gut feelings, in the quiet, inexplicable pull toward a life that feels more true. When the ego surrenders to this deeper guidance, not with defeat but with trust, something profound begins to shift. Life starts to feel less like a battle to be won and more like a conversation to be listened to. The path of individuation doesn't eliminate conflict. It teaches us how to hold it, how to live with paradox, how to contain tension without collapsing into chaos or clinging to false certainty. This ability to hold opposites is a sign of maturity. It's what transforms suffering into meaning, because growth doesn't come from avoiding discomfort. It comes from learning how to be present with it, from seeing pain as part of the process, not a sign of failure. Individuation invites us to meet the parts of ourselves we've disowned, the angry one, the tender one, the frightened one, the reckless one. Not to indulge them, but to understand them, to listen, to ask what they need, what they know, what they've been trying to protect us from. And as we begin to include what we once rejected, our inner world starts to reorganize. Suddenly, the energy we used to spend on suppression becomes available for creativity. The defenses we built against our feelings begin to soften. We cry more easily, yes, but we also laugh more freely. We feel more deeply, and as a result, we become more alive. This doesn't make life easier, but it does make it more real, more honest, more connected. And in that connection, anxiety begins to lose its grip, because anxiety thrives in separation, in the false belief that we are alone, broken, out of sync. But when we remember that we are already whole, even in our messiness, the fear starts to unravel. Individuation is not a destination. There's no final moment where everything clicks and the work is done. It's a rhythm, a relationship, a lifelong unfolding. But every time we choose honesty over performance, awareness over avoidance, self-compassion over self-judgment, we align more closely with the self. We take another step into our own wholeness. And in that step, we don't become someone new. We return to someone we've always been, someone we forgot when we were trying to be what the world expected, someone we lost when we believed we had to hide parts of ourselves to be loved, someone who has always lived quietly, beneath the surface, waiting for us to slow down, turn inward and listen. That someone is not afraid of the unknown, because they are the unknown. And in finally welcoming them home, we begin to understand what peace truly means. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of integration. Not control, but coherence. Not perfection, but presence. This is the work, and it's worth everything. There's a kind of gravity inside each of us, something invisible that shapes how we move through the world. We notice how we react, what we fear and what we hope for. That force is psychic energy, and it flows where our attention goes. But attention isn't just mental focus, it's emotional investment. It's the invisible currency of the soul. Wherever we place our emotional attention, whether on fear, hope, control, shame, or love, we are feeding something inside us. We are giving it life. We are reinforcing a lens through which we interpret reality. When we live in a state of chronic worry, we are not simply responding to life's difficulties, we are organizing our entire being around the assumption that life is dangerous, that the unknown is a threat, that we must always be prepared, always on guard, always a few steps ahead. This mindset doesn't arise because we're weak. It arises because at some point we learned that vigilance was safer than vulnerability, that being in control felt better than being open, that anticipating pain was more bearable than being surprised by it. Over time, these protective strategies solidify into patterns, and these patterns become stories that define how we see ourselves. I can't trust people. I have to do it all alone. If I let go, everything will fall apart. These aren't just thoughts, they're narratives infused with emotional charge. And that charge becomes the filter through which we see the world. The result? We find confirmation for the very fears we wish to escape. Not because we are cursed or broken, but because our perceptions, decisions, and reactions are being shaped by unresolved inner material. We enter relationships half-guarded and then wonder why we don't feel deeply connected. We sabotage opportunities and then say life never works out. We replay old wounds in new settings and call it bad luck. This isn't magic. It's pattern. It's resonance. It's the natural outcome of directing our energy toward what we fear instead of what we long to understand. The good news is that this energy is not fixed. We can redirect it. We can begin to shift our focus from fear to inquiry, from reaction to reflection, from avoidance to curiosity. And when we do, the psychic energy that was trapped in defensive habits begins to free itself. It becomes available for creativity, for connection, for insight. We stop feeding the endless loop of anxiety and start listening to what it was pointing toward all along. Because fear, when listened to, not obeyed, not suppressed, but truly listened to, is incredibly revealing. It often carries the voice of a younger part of us, one that learned certain beliefs at a time when we had very few tools to process experience. These parts don't need to be silenced. They need to be seen. They need to be welcomed into a larger, wiser perspective that we now have access to. Instead of asking, what bad thing might happen, we can begin to ask, what is this fear trying to show me? Perhaps it reveals a wound still unhealed, a boundary that's been crossed, a truth we've avoided, or an old story that no longer fits. When we ask with honesty and presence, we begin to see that fear is not the enemy. It is the signal. This shift in how we relate to fear changes everything. It doesn't mean we won't feel anxious. It means anxiety stops ruling our lives. It becomes one voice among many, not the loudest, not the most believable, but one that we now know how to listen to without collapsing into. Our psychic energy becomes more coherent. it flows toward integration instead of fragmentation. And as that happens, we notice small but powerful changes. We breathe more easily, we pause before reacting, we feel less overwhelmed by uncertainty. The world doesn't change, but our way of being in it does. This is not about bypassing pain or pretending everything is fine. It's about reclaiming authorship over our inner lives. It's about realizing that while we can't control everything that happens, we can choose what we give our energy to. We can choose which thoughts we feed, which emotions we follow, and which stories we continue to believe. Psychic energy is sacred, it's limited, it's deeply personal, and it's also incredibly powerful. When we begin to honor it, to direct it with intention, awareness, and compassion, we stop living as victims of our inner world. We become co-creators, not of a perfect life, but of a meaningful one. One where our wounds no longer define us, but inform us. Where our emotions no longer dominate us, but guide us. Where our fears no longer imprison us, but initiate us. And in that space where attention becomes intention and fear becomes invitation, we begin to experience a different kind of power. Not the power of control, the power of presence. There are moments in life that feel like something more than coincidence, an encounter at just the right time, a phrase you needed to hear showing up unexpectedly, a series of small signs that seem to whisper, "You're not lost." These moments can't be explained by logic alone, and yet they leave a mark, a sense that something within us is connected to something beyond us. This is what many call synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence, not random, not forced, something that arises when we stop trying to micromanage the universe and start aligning with our deeper truth. These events don't answer our questions in rational terms, they speak in symbols, in timing, in subtle shifts in energy that tell us we're moving in harmony with something real, even if invisible. When the ego loosens its grip, when we stop demanding certainty, stop rehearsing disaster, stop trying to make life obey our fear, that's when these moments tend to appear. Not because the world has changed, but because we have. Our perception softens, our inner defenses lower, and suddenly we're able to receive what's always been there, the hidden coherence between our inner world and the outer one. Synchronicity doesn't promise comfort. It promises meaning. It invites us to participate in a reality that's not governed solely by control, but by relationship, between psyche and symbol, between intention and intuition, between the part and the whole. And that's the essence of real trust. Trust doesn't mean believing that everything will go our way. It means believing that even when it doesn't, there is still intelligence unfolding, that we are not abandoned, that our experience, even when painful, belongs to something larger than we can comprehend in the moment. This kind of trust is not naive. It's earned, slowly, gently. By paying attention to the quiet ways life speaks when we stop shouting over it, it comes from noticing how the right insight arrived at the right time, how the breakdown opened space for a breakthrough, how, when you finally surrendered, what you truly needed found its way to you. But trust doesn't eliminate anxiety. It transforms how we hold it. We begin to realize that fear doesn't have to be the final voice, that not knowing is not the same as being unsafe, that uncertainty can be the birthplace of new life, not a threat to be neutralized, but a mystery to be lived. And so we live differently. We stop interpreting every challenge as a sign of failure and begin to see them as part of our unfolding. We stop needing guarantees and begin embracing guidance. We stop asking life to be predictable and start asking ourselves to be present. This is what it means to return to the self, not as a concept, but as a lived experience, a daily choice to orient ourselves not around fear, but around connection, around inner listening, around surrender, not as defeat, but as collaboration with something wiser within us. Synchronicity reminds us that we are not alone in this work, that there is a pattern in the chaos, a rhythm beneath the noise. And while we can't force that rhythm, we can learn to dance with it. We can learn to trust the way the pieces fit together, even when we can't see the whole picture. And that trust becomes a new kind of power. Not the power to control outcomes, but the power to meet life as it is, to hold space for contradiction, for beauty and pain, for longing and fulfillment, for fear and love existing in the same breath. To know that peace is not the absence of tension, but the presence of a heart wide enough to hold it. We no longer fight ourselves. We no longer resist what the psyche is trying to teach us. We begin to live from a place of coherence, not perfection, from alignment, not performance, from depth, not defense. And in that place, something extraordinary happens. Worry no longer defines us. It becomes what it was always meant to be, a call to return. To return to the body, to the breath, to the moment. To return to what is real right now, not what might happen tomorrow, not what should have happened yesterday, but what life is offering in this very second, beneath the noise of fear. The peace we seek is not the reward for controlling everything. It is the result of surrendering with presence, of choosing to believe, not blindly, but consciously, that life can be trusted when we're aligned with our inner truth. That the self is not a distant ideal, but the quiet guide we've always had, and that even in the hardest seasons, we are being led not by guarantees but by grace. So if you find yourself worrying again, caught in the spiral, trying to predict, trying to prepare, pause, not to force yourself into calm, but to ask, what is this fear trying to show me about what I truly need? What am I being asked to trust even now? And maybe in that moment, you'll feel it. A shift, a softness, a silence, a reminder that you are not lost. You are simply being invited home,